One Family Fund is an organization based in Jerusalem, and I sat down with Yehuda Bosh and asked him, what is the One Family Fund?
The One Family Fund is the central organization in Israel providing assistance to victims of terrorism.
And how long have you been formed here?
The organization was established in September of 2001 in the immediate aftermath of the suicide bombing at the Sbarro restaurant in Jerusalem.
So how does somebody feel directly after a terrorist attack?
It depends on the person, and it's a whole range of feelings. They'll feel emotional trauma, they'll feel sadness, they'll feel pain, they'll feel bereft. They'll feel like they've lost something, whether it's an ability or a talent or a loved one, or even just a part of their own lives.
Do they withdraw within themselves?
Occasionally they do. There are numbers of cases that we have, dozens and hundreds of cases that we have where people do, and there are many cases where people actually go in the opposite direction, where they feel, okay, now I have to achieve something.
Is it hard for someone to actually go outside after that, or to trust other people anymore?
To various extents it is. I mean, the one thing you have to understand is that we're dealing with victims of terrorism for the last 7.5 years, since September of 2000. We're dealing with 1,166 people who've been killed. We're dealing with over 10,000 people who've been injured. When you're dealing with that kind of a sizable population, there is no single answer to any of these questions. Every one of them reacts differently within their own personality. And the one thing that the One Family Fund does that other organizations don't, and even if they do, they don't do as well or whatever, is that we take each individual victim of terror as they are, in their own circumstances, in their own reactions, in their own family situation, in their own employment situation, in their own social situation, and we handle their circumstances as they are. We're not an organization that will come to a victim and say, you have 20% disability and therefore you're entitled to this, or you've lost a child and therefore you're entitled to this, or you're a widow and therefore you're entitled to that. We don't have set definitions of what a terror victim is or what a terror victim needs, beyond that a terror victim is a victim of terror in their own circumstances, and that their needs exist in the circumstances that they're in.
So how does somebody actually get over a terrorist attack?
Nobody ever gets over a terrorist attack. That's the honest truth. We have in the next room a bereaved mother who, her son was killed in June of 2001 in an anti-terror operation as part of the army. And she will tell you that, and she's said it, and it's like a direct quote from her, people say that time heals all wounds, and it's not true. It's the exact opposite. Every year at the memorial service for her son's friends from school and from the army come, and they're still in touch with the family, and the family values the relationships and the friendships. And now, her son, instead of being a 20-year-old soldier in 2001, would now have been a 27-year-old young man starting out a career and starting out a family. And at the memorial service, when all of his high school friends and all of his army buddies show up, they show up having finished the army, having finished college, having started families, having children coming with them. And you know, our office administrator here, the bereaved mother, stands there at the gravesite and looks at all of these people, and the first thing that goes through her mind is, why couldn't my son be like them? Why couldn't I have the same grandchildren? Why couldn't I have the same, you know, satisfaction of seeing my son grow up and become and start a family of his own?
Now, do many people who survive a terrorist attack feel guilty afterwards?
Again, to varying levels. Some people don't. Some people view it as a challenge. Some people view it as a reason for them to start something, a reason for them to give, a reason for them to initiate. And some people do feel guilt. A lot of them, to some level, I'm sure a lot of them do feel guilt.
Now, when you listen to the news, you often hear that a certain number of people died in a terrorist attack, but many, many people are also injured and seriously injured. What sort of injuries do they receive during a terrorist attack?
All kinds. Emotional injury, physical injury. If it's a situation of a suicide bombing, then in general, the physical injuries will include torn eardrums, just from the shockwave of the blast. But physical injuries run the gamut from completely disemboweling a person to a couple of scrapes and scratches. Emotional injuries run the gamut from taking a perfectly stable, perfectly normal person and turning him into a walking automaton to almost nothing except the occasional flashback.
Now we hear that Palestinians make suicide belts as they go onto the buses. What is a suicide belt? What's it contain?
In general, what it contains is explosive material, whether it's TNT or C4 or something else, and usually between 5 and 10 kilograms of explosive material. In addition, it will include shrapnel, metal, nails, ball bearings, whatever it is, occasionally dipped in poison, to try to maximize the number of injuries and the number of deaths. Because in addition to just an explosion, if you have flying pieces of metal all over the place in an enclosed place, whoever the explosion doesn't hurt, a flying ball bearing might hit. And that's the aim. The aim is to cause as much death and as much suffering as possible.
So let's look at some statistics. How many children have been left orphaned during suicide bombings?
I'm going to go bigger than suicide bombings. There were 935 children aged 0 to 19 at the time of a terrorist attack who've lost at least one parent. That includes 47 children who were not yet born, and it includes children ranging all the way up to age 19.
And how many pregnant women have been killed?
9, including 10 fetuses.
How many Israelis have been killed in terrorist attacks altogether?
1,166, and that's not including the Second Lebanon War, where there were another 162 killed.
And how many people have been wounded in all that?
I don't have an exact statistic, but it's over 10,000. And the reason why there's no exact statistic is because it depends on who you ask. Some people will consider a person who goes into shock as injured, and some people won't. For instance, in June of 2003, there was a bus bombing in downtown Jerusalem. I was 2 blocks away from the bombing. So I started helping, and I know that a terror victim may be somebody who wasn't on the bus. It may be somebody who was walking on the street a block away and who saw the scene, who saw the blood, who saw the gore, and then walked off, went home, and 3 days later has a nervous breakdown. That person is not going to be recognized as a terror victim unless that person goes into the hospital and has his name down on some list somewhere. So the people who were walking around in the area, I was trying to help them to go into the emergency room. And people were saying, but I wasn't hurt. I wasn't, I was here, not there. I said, don't worry, go into the emergency room, put your name down on the list, and then go home. And among the people that I was trying to help, there was one woman walking up and down the street. This is 10 minutes after the bus blew up, completely covered in blood. And she came over to me and she saw that I was trying to help people, and she said, tell me something. I heard there was a bus bombing. Is everybody okay? This is a woman who's completely covered in blood. She was there. I found out later that the woman was not physically injured and that she wasn't even on the bus, but had been next to the bus, and when a particular person who was either on the bus or just outside the bus became physically injured, the blood splattered all over her. She went into shock to the point where she couldn't remember something that happened 10 minutes ago. And she said, I heard there was an attack. Is everybody okay? And she's walking around covered in blood. I knew that this person needed to see a doctor. So I helped her to come into the hospital. Okay? In some statistics, she wouldn't be considered injured. In some statistics, she would. So the number of wounded victims is not a hard and fast number that you can find anywhere.
So how much does terrorism actually affect the state of Israel itself?
Well, I'll tell you, terrorism affects the state of Israel in a number of ways. First of all, you're dealing with about 11,000 or 12,000 people who have been killed or injured. Then you're talking about their first-degree relatives. So you're talking about, on average, of 5 members in a family, let's say, for the sake of argument. So you're talking about another 15,000 people that we're talking about here. Then you're talking about the financial cost to the country. Every terror victim who's killed, their parents and or children, orphans, are entitled to financial support from the government. A person who's wounded in a terror attack is entitled to financial support from the government based on their disability. And that number runs into the hundreds of millions of shekels every year, just in terms of the assistance. So how does it affect the country? 1 out of every 260 households in this country has suffered the loss of a family member, or injury, loss or injury of a family member. We're talking about a country with 7.25 million people. The entire population of Israel is smaller than the population of London. It's smaller than the population of New York. It's probably the equivalent to the population of Chicago. And 1 out of every 260 households has either lost a member or had a member injured. We're talking about, I'm going to take St. Louis because it's the one that I'm familiar with. If an entire city the size of St. Louis, every single member of that city either killed or injured in 7 years as a percentage of the United States population. That's what we're talking about in Israel.
So everybody must really know someone who's been killed in a terrorist attack.
Either killed or injured, yeah. I mean, personally, without any relation to the fact that I work at one family, I personally know one woman who's lost a sister in a terror attack, who happens to be a neighbor of mine. And through my work in the organization, I've come to know hundreds of more people who are bereaved and hundreds more people who have been injured.
Now, what sort of things do you do to help here in the One Family Fund?
Well, like I said, we take each individual victim in their own circumstances. Depending on what they need in their circumstances, we can help them with their needs. We have field workers across the country. Each field worker is responsible for maintaining contact with all of the families in their region. We've divided the country into 5 regions, and in practice, each field worker maintains contact with between 500 and 800 families in their regions, and that's both killed and injured. In terms of assistance that we give to each victim, the assistance includes financial assistance, obviously. It includes payment for grants for tuition for bereaved siblings or children of victims who are now going to university or colleges. It includes medical assistance. It includes paying for psychiatric or psychological opinions to help an appeal for greater disability with the government. It includes programs for youth and children, including camps 3 times a year. It includes holiday events. It includes excursions for 20-something. The 20-something crowd who are bereaved siblings. It includes building social connections for them. It includes help finding jobs. It includes help supporting new households, new marriages that take place. Bar and bat mitzvah assistance when a child reaches the age of becoming an adult. It includes therapeutic retreats and workshops and excursions for groups, for bereaved parents, for wounded victims, for widows and widowers. And it includes just a feeling of that this is a place they can come when they know they can count on somebody as a family member. If a kid is 18 years old and needs to have money to go and take driving lessons, but the father has been killed and the family has no income, they can come to us for the same treatment. That's the feeling that they get when they come here. It's a feeling of family. It's not just the name of the organization. It's what we do every day. And it provides for a tremendously rewarding organization to be a part of, as well as a tremendous amount of comfort for the beneficiaries of the organization.
Now, you say you offer therapy to people who have been injured. Is that a bit difficult, and is it expensive to give people therapy?
It depends on the person. In terms of expense, we have a psychologist on staff who meets with people all the time in Jerusalem or at our offices in Ranana or Hadera. And the retreats that we provide bring in all other therapists from outside as well that we're in touch with, that we know do a good job. And they'll lead different kinds of therapy each time. It'll be art therapy or music therapy or dance therapy or other kinds of movement therapy or even hydrotherapy. It'll be discussions. It'll be trying to look at the world from a different way. So it might be bringing in a different artistic expression, or it might be something more spiritual if it's a religious group. It might be talking about some lesson that's learned from the Bible, with a way of looking at things that maybe the families haven't thought of or haven't encountered yet.
Now, terrorism affects everybody, and it even affects the youth. How do the youth cope with after a terrorist attack, and what do you do to help them?
Well, youth cope with it in very different ways. I mean, they're youth, they're children, they're not adults. They haven't built up the coping mechanisms that adults have, but at the same time, they haven't yet lost the natural coping mechanisms of children. So the coping is different. What we do for them is we run programs geared towards youth and sometimes geared towards children. I mentioned already we have camps 3 times a year. So it's 10 days during the summer, 4 days during the Hanukkah break, and 4 days during the Passover holiday, or just before the Passover holiday. At those camps, they're brought out. It's a sleepaway camp, which is very rare in Israel. And they're brought out with a group of 300 other kids, all of whom are like them, where they, again, build friendships and build social circles where they're understood, where they're, they don't have to explain themselves. They don't have to put on a mask of, everything's okay, because everything's not. They have counselors and coordinators that are specifically trained for any kind of reaction that might come out suddenly due to the child's tension in the family, or due to the child's background, or due to the child's situation now. And they're trained to deal with it. And they're trained to deal with it in a way that child needs, We had a case where we had a kid who'd been to 3 camps for an entire year, was a model camper. He was social, he was friendly, he would take part in all the sports, he was great, he was, just a model kid. And at the 4th camp, he started acting out, and he started having sudden outbursts of anger, and he would throw things, and he would hit other kids, and he would just yell at people for no reason. And the staff knew that this had something to do with his situation at home, that he's a terror victim, that his father had been killed. Rather than, sit the kid down and discipline him, or rather than send him home, or rather than call the parents and say, look, I can't handle this, the staff here is trained to love the kid through it. And what they did was they sat down with the kid and they said, listen, I'm here. I'm your friend. You know me already. Tell me what's going on. And they, over the course of 3 days, brought out from the kid that the kid's mother had been working and lost her job, and there was no money coming into the family other than a little bit of benefits, and that there was a lot of tension because they didn't know where the next meal was coming from, and that the mother had become so tense that she couldn't handle the kids anymore, and the kids were all, the whole family was just exploding in anger and exploding in tension. So they brought in a psychologist to deal with the kid, but at the same time they called the field worker and said, go visit the family and make a house call and see what the story is, because this kid's telling me stuff that you need to know, that you need to go and see. And we found out that the mother indeed lost her job. We found out that they were falling into debt. We found out that the kids had been asking for school books and clothes and games and whatever, and the mother kept saying, no, I can't, no, I can't, no, I can't. And to tell your kid, no, I can't, for even every little thing for months on end, leaves the kid feeling abandoned. So the field worker put in a request to the organization for financial assistance, for monthly assistance, and we helped the family to tide it over until the mother could find another job. We wouldn't have known about the family's financial distress except for the fact that the kid was breaking up in camp. So when you have an organization that just deals with a camp, or just deals with a retreat, or just deals with financial assistance, they're not in a position to give the kind of comprehensive assistance that a family might need. And yet the One Family Fund, that's exactly what we do. That's the model that we're built on, is that we can give that kind of comprehensive assistance whenever it's needed.
Are there many untold stories behind the headlines?
Every headline has dozens of them. This kid, for an example, there are stories. I mean, the massacre at the Merkaz Rav Yeshiva last month, 8 people were killed. There were 8, heroic stories behind them. There was the story of the 26-year-old Ethiopian immigrant who came to Israel in 1991, completely poor. I mean, they came with nothing. They lived in a tenement. They eked out a living somehow, and they basically lived with very little. And this kid was a genius. But because of his economic background and because of the fact that he came from Ethiopia, where he had no way of learning anything, he was behind in his studies. And he wanted to go to the top yeshiva, the top rabbinical seminary in the country. And he approached Merkaz Harav, and they said, we'd love to have you, but you're not up to par. So, go learn somewhere else. And the kid said, no, I don't want to learn anywhere else. I want to learn here. So I'll tell you what. Don't accept me as a student. Accept me as a dishwasher. Okay, I'm going to work in the kitchen every day, 6 days a week, and I'm going to wash the dishes. That's what I'm going to do. So that's what they did. He washed the dishes, and of course, it's only 3 meals a day. So for all the time in between the meals, he had nothing to do. He went up into the library and studied, and after 2 years, he had brought himself up to the level where the yeshiva said, okay, now we can accept you. And he was, and then he became the top student in his class. I mean, that's a story out of, Jewish mythology already, that we've had rabbis that have done that, and that's what this kid was doing. There are stories. Every person is a story. The Jewish tradition, and I'm sure Christian traditions, say that if you save one life, it's as if you've saved an entire world, and if you destroy one life, it's as if you've destroyed an entire world. And working at One Family and meeting the people and seeing what they go through and hearing their backgrounds, it's very, very true. Every single person, particularly in a country like Israel, where most people are immigrants, and if they're not themselves immigrants, then they're third-generation immigrants, every single person here has a story. It's a different background. It's a different culture. It's the story of a life. It's the story of an entire world that they've built, that they represent, and that gets destroyed in a terrorist attack. Even if a person's not killed, there's a certain element of destruction that goes into the life of a person who survives.
So does everybody want to become a suicide bomber, or are some of them coerced into becoming bombers?
Well, I'm assuming you're talking about the Arabs here. No, not everybody wants to become a suicide bomber. I'm sure that it's a very small minority that actually want to do it. What we're dealing with here, and you see it if you go to Sderot and you stand on the hilltop at the edge of town and you see Sderot on one side and Beit Hanun on the other, you see the difference in life. I go to Sderot usually once a month at least, and I show people a building in Sderot, in the middle of Sderot, called Beit Ella, the house of Ella. Ella was Ella Abu Kassis, a 17-year-old girl who was murdered by a Qassam rocket attack in January of 2005. Her parents decided that in her memory they were going to erect this building in the middle of Sderot, and they were going to stock it with books and computers and internet connections and encyclopedias, and they were going to make it into a place where high school students and elementary school students could come and do their homework in a protected environment, where they didn't have to worry about Qassams hitting their house, where they could come and learn, where there would be somebody on staff to help them, where they could build something. And in a place like Sderot, which is a low-income city, having that kind of a resource is incredibly important for students. It could make the difference between letting them go to university or letting them go to work in a factory. That's the reaction in Israel to somebody being killed. In the Palestinian society, on the other hand, we had a story not long afterwards, maybe a year afterwards, of a pregnant woman who was pregnant with her 9th child, and this woman's 16-year-old daughter, who were both sent out to become suicide terrorists on the same day in 2 different cities, and they were caught. And I'm left here wondering, okay, you have on the one hand a family that honors life so much that when they lose it, they dedicate themselves to helping others build their own. And on the other hand, you have a society that honors death so much that when a woman is pregnant with her 9th child, the best they can do for her is say, go kill yourself. It's not the people in the Gaza Strip or in Judea and Samaria who want to kill Jews necessarily. I mean, there are people who want to, but it's not all of them, and it's not even most of them. But the leadership that indoctrinates their children, that indoctrinates their parents, and that tells them that the most glorious thing in the world to do is to kill yourself and as many other people as possible, is the difference between a society of life and a society of death. Now, society is led by leaders, by business leaders, by educational leaders, by governmental leaders, regardless what kind of society it is. And when it's the leadership, the educational leadership, the cultural leadership, the political leadership, that has defined as its primary interest the murder of other people, then it will build its society in such a way to indoctrinate that society to kill those other people. That's what we're facing. I don't blame the Palestinians, the individual Palestinians, the mom and pop who need to put food on their table or who need to send their kids to school. I do blame the Palestinian leadership. I blame Palestinian education system. I blame the Palestinian culture whose quote-unquote state-sponsored television shows a cartoon show for children. 3-year-olds, right, in the States watch Tom and Jerry. In Israel, they watch also cartoons. But here, the cartoons are telling the children about how the terrible Israeli government, the terrible Israeli Zionist people killed my brother Mouse, and therefore I'm going to go and kill them. That, to a Palestinian child watching a cartoon show, is the ideal. That's what the government wants the ideal to be, so that 3-year-old now grows up wanting to kill people.
Do you see the struggle between the Palestinians and Israelis a Palestinian issue, or is it an Islamic issue?
I see it more as a Palestinian issue. There are 22 independent Arab countries in the world and a further dozen or so Islamic countries in the world. None of them have lifted a finger in 50 years or 60 years to help the Arabs living in the land of Israel. They told these people to get out of the way so they could wipe Israel off the map in 1948. And when they failed in that mission, they did nothing to help the Arabs that they told to get out of the way. Those people, now called the Palestinians, are the only refugee population in the world that has not been resettled in such a long time. In the history of the world, you have Jewish refugees from Arab countries in 1948 who were resettled within 3 years here and are now leading members of the society. Politicians and business leaders and cultural leaders all over the place. But the Arab countries, with all of their wealth and all of their resources and all of their empty land, I mean, Jordan has half the population of Israel in 7 or 8 times the amount of land. Okay, none of them have done a thing to resettle, to relocate, to employ, to educate, to develop healthcare. There's nothing going on here. The Palestinians are the probably the single most unfortunate group in the world, and I place the blame squarely on the Arab world, the Islamic world, for not helping them. But I don't see it as an Islamic struggle against non-Islam. I see it more as an issue of the Palestinians themselves. When the problems of the Palestinians are solved, and I put the responsibility for solving those problems on the Arab world, then I think the entire conflict will calm down.
So do you think the Palestinians have been left as pawns to be used to criticize Israel more than actually help themselves?
Absolutely. And if you want any proof of that, all you need to do is look at United Nations resolutions. When repeatedly throughout history, Israel has tried to relocate and resettle Palestinians to build them proper homes and proper communities rather than refugee camps and shantytowns. And every single time they try, the UN condemns it, led by what they call a non-aligned movement, which is basically aligned with the Arab world. To the point where the entire world is left with their hands tied until the Arabs decide that the Palestinians can be resettled somewhere.
Now, the town of Sderot has been the victim of terrorism with constant rocket attacks. How many rockets have hit Sderot so far, Yehuda?
Sderot itself I couldn't tell you, but I can tell you that about 8,300 have been fired at Sderot and the surrounding communities since April 2001. Today's actually the 7th anniversary of the first one.
So how does this affect this small town?
Sderot has an official registered population of about 22,000 people. Between 10 and 15% of them have left the city. And the ones that remain are in constant fear. Almost all of them are suffering from post-trauma to one extent or another. When they walk out of the house, the first thing they do is look and see where the nearest stairwell or bomb shelter is. I mean, I went to visit a family recently in Sderot where we were sitting in the living room and we were talking to the parents. The kids were away at school. It comes 3 o'clock, it's the end of the school day, and the father says, "You'll have to excuse me, I have to go pick up my daughter from school." Pretty natural thing. It happens to every suburban mom or dad in the world. And he left, and he was back home with his daughter in 2 minutes flat. And he lived on the 3rd floor of a walk-up of an apartment building, and the first thing we did was we were in shock. We were like, how close is this school? And he said, "Look out the window. It's across the street, next building over." And we said, "Wait a minute. And you had to go and pick your daughter? I mean, your daughter's 9 years old. She can cross the street herself, and that's all it is." And he said, "No, I won't let my daughter walk outside of the building by herself because it's too dangerous. Who knows if a rocket will launch during that 30 seconds that it takes her to walk across the street. And we don't have 30 seconds of leeway here. We only have 15 because we're that close to the Gaza Strip. And I just won't let her walk outside by herself." And I started thinking to myself, growing up in suburban North America, where I walked home from school on my own at the age of 6 and a 15-minute walk, and that freedom doesn't exist in a town like Sderot anymore. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that I recently heard a story of a baby who was born to a woman in Sderot. Perfectly healthy, beautiful baby, weighed 7.5 pounds. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything better. And the baby was, quiet and eating and doing whatever normal 1 or 2 week old babies do. And then once the baby was 2.5 weeks old, the baby started suffering seizures, just very suddenly one day, just as if the baby somehow had contracted epilepsy or something. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong with this kid. And they took the kid from one doctor to another, from one hospital to another. And finally somebody said, "Wait a minute, you live in Sderot, don't you?" And they said, "Yes." And they said, "Okay, that's what's wrong with the baby." "What do you mean?" "The baby's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder." And we said, "But wait a minute, the baby's only 2 weeks old." And she said, "Yeah, but the baby was also in gestation for 9 months. And there were countless rocket attacks during the 9 months. And every time there was a rocket attack, the mother started, with adrenaline and fear, and the baby sensed it. And the baby's now suffering from post-trauma from the previous 9 months." It gets to the guts of a person, into the guts of a life, when a baby still in the mother's womb is already suffering from post-trauma. I mean, what kind of hope is there after that?
So do you have any success stories of some of the things you've been doing here?
Oh, there's lots of success stories. I mean, we just 2 weeks ago celebrated a wedding of 2 people who had both lost a parent in a terror attack. And they met through the one family young adults division, the 20-somethings crowd. And they started going out, and they decided to get married. And when they got married, they both came to us and said, "Look, her mother, his father, and neither side has the financial wherewithal to pay for the wedding. So we gave the couple money to help cover the cost of the wedding, and half of our staff was at the wedding, and it was a tremendously joyous occasion. When it always happens like that, when somebody's been through such hell, they lose a parent, they lose a breadwinner so suddenly in such horrifying circumstances, and their lives are shattered. They just don't know what to do with themselves. And then all of a sudden, 3 or 4 years later, they're getting married, they're rebuilding, and not only are they getting married and rebuilding, but they're getting married to somebody else who's gone through exactly the same thing, because they feel comfortable with somebody else who understands them. And rebuilding and building a new life. And now when they go and have a child and whatever it is, a year or 2 years or 3 years, they'll name it after this parent, they'll name it after that parent, they'll continue into the next generation with the traditions and with the life's work and achievements of the person that's been lost. Yes, the world of the person who's been lost has been destroyed, but now they're rebuilding another life and rebuilding another world. To me, that's like a tremendous success.
Okay, so on your website it says in 2002, 458 people were killed, and in 2007, 13 people were killed. Are Palestinians not fighting anymore, or is Israel actually getting better at dealing with the issue?
To a certain extent, Israel is getting much better at dealing with the issue. 2002 was the absolute worst year in the last 7, and March 2002 was the worst month in Israeli history. In 2007 alone, the entire year, we had only 10% of the people killed as we had in March of 2002 alone. Israel's getting much better at handling the situation. The security is much better, it's much tighter, it's much more complete. And we've also created a situation where the infrastructure that the terrorists use to back themselves up has been seriously damaged. Israel has also done a tremendous amount of work around the world in terms of bringing the truth of terrorism to foreign decision makers, the United Nations, the United States, and Europe. Lastly, it's just gotten to the point where a lot of the abilities of the terrorists have been undermined. In terms of whether the Palestinians have decided to stop fighting, in Judea and Samaria, you might be able to say that. In the Gaza Strip, certainly not. They've changed tactics. Instead of sending a suicide bomber into a downtown market to blow himself up and kill 20 or 30 people, they're now firing rockets at Israeli population centers, which are notoriously inaccurate and very primitive. So a rocket will land, it'll kill one person, if any, because basically that's what they can do now.
Now the wall, when Israel built the wall, was very controversial. Has it actually reduced terrorist attacks?
Well, I'll tell you, the Israeli left, when the wall was first started, the Israeli left were in great joy about it, and the Israeli right was dead set against it, because it was felt then that the wall would demarcate a future boundary, and that it would be an artificial boundary at that. But very quickly, the number of terrorist attacks went down, the number of fatalities went down, the number of injuries went down, and all of a sudden you see almost the opposite. The Israeli right is now saying, okay, we have to live with the wall, and at least the wall is doing us some good. Whereas you still have demonstrations now about the path of the wall, about building a wall at all, and the demonstrators are Palestinians and Israeli left-wing extremists who are now against the wall. Why are they against the wall? Because it's going to be cutting off Palestinian communities from Israel, or from pre-67 Israel. And of course the Palestinians don't want to be cut off from pre-67 Israel because that's where their economic future is. In addition to, that's where their terrorist targets are.
Now your organization's been endorsed by Benjamin Netanyahu, the former Israeli Prime Minister. What's it feel like to have somebody so prominent fighting for you?
Well, I'll tell you something. Benjamin Netanyahu is more than just the Israeli former Prime Minister. He's also one of the foremost experts on anti-terrorism in the world. He's written a number of books. He's spoken at conferences almost every year. For a while, he was the Israeli ambassador to the UN, and that was his primary issue. And he has served as an advisor to international organizations that fight against terrorism in terms of planning anti-terror operations, in terms of designing anti-terror capabilities. To have someone of his stature as a supporter of the organization, as a vocal supporter of the organization, is tremendously important. A, because he's a former prime minister and because he's a well-known personality around the world, and B, because of his credentials in the anti-terrorism front. In addition to that, when he comes to the building to our office, whatever it is, once a year, or however often it is, it's always, an event. I mean, there's security all over the place, and he always has something very warm and very supportive to say to the people that he meets, to the victims that he meets, and it's personal. The most important thing, I think, is that it's personal. He's a part of the family. He himself is a terror victim. His brother was killed in an anti-terror operation 30 years ago. And to have another terror victim, a bereaved mother, a wounded victim, approached by a man like Benjamin Netanyahu, have his hand shook, have a few words of comfort said to him, and know that it comes not because it's a politician looking for publicity, but because it's a human being who's experienced it, speaking to another human being who's experienced it, and expressing not only his own personal support and comfort, but the support and comfort of all of the people that he represents and of the entire nation that he represents, has such a tremendous meaning and such a tremendous therapeutic effect on people that I think I would take his support over anybody else's just because of where he comes from.
Now, your organization is called the One Family Fund. Does Israel feel like one big family?
Oh, always. It's a small country and everyone knows everybody. Israel is a country where you can call up, a government minister on the phone and actually get him on the phone and open up the conversation by saying, hi, Itzik, how are you doing? Rather than, hi, Mr. So-and-so. It's a very, very much a country that's on first-name basis with everybody. And if you don't know a person and you go over to the person and just shake his hands, within 30 seconds you'll be on a first-name basis with him also. It's great to live here just for that reason, because everyone is so friendly and so, accepting and so just family. I mean, I remember when my oldest son was born, he was about 6 months old, and I had to go shopping. I took him with me to go shopping, and I was carrying him in the snuggly. And he slept through the whole thing. When we got to the checkout counter, he woke up and started crying, and he couldn't stop crying. He needed to be changed, and he was hungry, and he was whatever, and he just didn't stop crying at all. The woman who was in line behind me walked around me, unloaded my shopping cart, put everything through the checkout, put it all in the shopping bags, put it back in my checkout cart, and then went and said, have a good evening. The only thing she didn't do was pay for it, and I'd been in Israel all of 2 years at that point, and I was like, that's really wonderful. That's somebody who could have been really annoyed at a squalling baby, and instead she lended a hand to help. That's Israel. And to a very large extent, that's One Family. One Family is a kind of organization where we can say, look, it's just too difficult for us. It's too tough for us. You're looking at so much pain and so much sorrow and so much suffering and so much tension, and it's all the time. And, people who work here because they want to help. They work here because it's a family. They work here because rather than being annoyed or rather than being put off by all of the pain and all of the suffering and all of the constant complaints, they want to turn around and they want to say, what, how can I help? How can I make it better? They don't even ask. The people who work here don't even ask. They'll go to visit a person, and I went on a house visit with a field worker in Sderot, an elderly couple where he had been injured and his knee had been destroyed by the explosion of a Qassam rocket, and his wife was physically disabled from beforehand, from her youth. And they're sitting at home, they have no income other than a little bit of benefits, so we gave them some financial help. But while we were on the house visit, I started looking around the apartment, and I realized that the walls were not connected to each other. And the walls were not connected to the ceiling. And the outer walls were not connected to the floors or the ceilings or the walls of the inner rooms. It was a prefab building, and the place was falling apart. And the whole apartment was being held together by a little bit of insulation between each wall and the cracks between the walls. And I pointed it out to the field worker, and he said, okay, we have to do something about this. He didn't ask the family why, and he didn't ask the family how they can manage, but he went and he found the building contractor to come in and repair the apartment. And when it came time for the building contractor, he went and he negotiated a lower rate from the building contractor. He went and he figured out a way for the family to be able to afford the building contractor's rates through payments, and the financial assistance that we gave them went in part to pay the building contractor his fees. So that by the time the winter came, the family was living in a house that didn't have any drafts, that it wasn't leaking, and all of a sudden it was more comfortable for them. That's not something that we would go and ask. It's something that we're trained to look for, just by looking around the apartment, by seeing what kind of a situation the family lives in. And it's not something that a bureaucratic environment would be able to answer. They would say, okay, you have 20% disability, you're going to get this amount of money. They don't go and look and see the cracks in the walls. They don't go and look and see the cracks in the lives. They answer it with a bureaucratic answer because that's the way the bureaucratic system is built. We're built differently. We're built to look at the cracks. We're built to look at the family. And we're built to answer the needs of the family, to fill in the cracks, and to say, okay, this is how we can help.
So finally, what's your prayer for the Israelis and the Palestinian people?
My prayer for the Israelis is that they find the leadership and the courage and the vision that created this country, and that they learn once again how to use it properly. My prayer for the Palestinians is that they find the courage and the vision to overturn their own leadership and to finally realize that the only way that they're actually ever going to get out of their problems is to join the rest of the world in progress. And my prayer for all of humanity is that we very quickly come to a point where hope overtakes anguish, where people can look to the future and see it brighter. And if that means the Messiah, or if that means, just coming together of humanity, that it happens sooner than later.
Now, you have a website for people who would like to know more. What's your website address?
Sure, the website address of the organization is www.onefamilyfund.org. One Family Fund is it in one word.